3 days after Michael Carter walked away from a 15-year career without so much as a goodbye meeting, a black luxury sedan rolled slowly down his quiet street and stopped in front of his modest rental home. And when he opened the door expecting a delivery, or maybe a confused driver, he instead found his former boss standing there in the afternoon heat, alone and unannounced, holding nothing but a set of car keys and an expression that told him she hadn't come to argue, hadn't come to apologize, and definitely hadn't come for anything simple, but to understand why a man who had spent a decade and a half proving himself indispensable had simply vanished overnight. The truth was, it hadn't happened overnight. Not really. It had been building for years in small, quiet fractures that no one at the office ever noticed because Michael had become very good at hiding them. The kind of employee who showed up early, stayed late, delivered results, and never complained. The kind of man managers pointed to when they talked about reliability without ever asking what it cost him to maintain it. And for a long time, he believed that was enough, that if he just kept everything steady at work, he could somehow hold everything else together too. Even after the accident that took his wife 2 winters ago on a rain-slick highway just 10 minutes from home, the kind of accident people describe as instant, as if that word softens anything, leaving him alone with their daughter Ava, who had already required more care than most children long before that night. Born with a neurological condition that affected her muscle control, her coordination, her ability to speak clearly, a condition that meant therapy appointments, specialized schooling, constant monitoring, and above all, consistency, the one thing Michael struggled most to provide while working a demanding full-time job that didn't bend for anything. At first, he told himself he could manage it, that people did harder things every day, so he built a routine so precise it left no room for error. Mornings starting before sunrise to help Ava dress, eat, and prepare for school. Then a 45-minute commute through traffic to an office where he switched into a different version of himself, focused, composed, efficient, the version that could sit through meetings about quarterly targets while his phone stayed face down on the table, silent, but never out of mind. Afternoons filled with deadlines and emails, and the quiet pressure of expectations that never really paused. And then the drive back home where he stepped into his real life again, into a house that still carried the absence of his wife in every corner, and a daughter who greeted him not with words, but with a look that held everything she couldn't say. And for a while, that routine held, not perfectly, not comfortably, but enough to get through each day without everything collapsing at once. The cracks started showing in smaller ways first. Missed therapy sessions because meetings ran late, hurried dinners, nights where Ava struggled, and he didn't have the energy to do more than sit beside her and hope it was enough. And then the calls from her school began to change in tone, from updates to concerns, her progress slowing, her needs increasing, the recommendation coming gently at first and then more firmly, that she would benefit from more consistent care at home, that the current arrangement wasn't sustainable, that she needed him more than he was able to give. And Michael heard it, understood it, felt it settle somewhere heavy and unavoidable. But still he hesitated because walking away from his job wasn't just a decision. It was a risk, a financial cliff he wasn't sure he could survive. So instead he did what made sense in the world he knew. He asked for help the only way he thought he could, through a formal request, carefully written, professionally worded, outlining Ava's condition, the recent developments, the need for temporary flexibility, just 3 months of adjusted hours or remote work to stabilize things at home. Nothing permanent, nothing unreasonable, at least not to him. And he submitted it with the quiet hope that 15 years of loyalty might count for something, that someone would look at his record and see not just an employee, but a person who had earned a little understanding. The response came back 2 days later in an email so brief it almost felt accidental, a denial framed in policy language, citing operational requirements and role expectations, no offer to discuss alternatives, no acknowledgement of the situation beyond the line that confirmed it had been reviewed. And Michael read it once, then again, as if something might change the second time, but it didn't. And what stayed with him wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder, the realization that none of it had mattered in the way he thought it did. Not the years, not the effort, not the quiet sacrifices that had shaped his life around the job. Because in that moment, he understood clearly that the system he had trusted to hold steady simply didn't see him beyond what he produced. He didn't quit that day or the next, because decisions like that don't happen all at once. They settle in slowly, waiting for the moment when they can no longer be ignored. And that moment came on a Wednesday evening when his phone rang during a meeting he couldn't leave. The number from Ava's school flashing on the screen while voices continued around the table, and he hesitated just long enough to miss the call, stepping out only after it ended, listening to the voicemail with a tightening chest as the school nurse explained that Ava had experienced a seizure, that she was stable now but shaken, that it might be best if he came immediately, and he drove there faster than he ever had, the city blurring past in a way that made everything else feel distant and irrelevant. Finding her in the nurse's office, small and quiet, her body still recovering, her eyes searching for him the second he walked in. And in that moment, whatever balance he had been trying to maintain finally broke, not dramatically, not with anger or confrontation, but with a clarity so complete it left no room for doubt. The next morning, he went into the office as usual, the same building, the same elevator, the same desk he had sat at for years, but everything felt different now, like a place he recognized but no longer belonged to. And he didn't call a meeting or draft a long resignation letter. He simply walked to HR, placed his badge on the desk, and said the only thing that mattered, that his daughter needed him, that he wouldn't be coming back, and before anyone could respond, before questions or policies or procedures could catch up to him, he turned and left, stepping out of the glass building into the open air where, for the first time in a long time, the future was uncertain, unstable, and entirely his to face. 3 days after Michael Carter walked away from his job, just as the quiet routine of his new life was beginning to settle into something manageable, the sound of a smooth, unfamiliar engine drifted into the street and stopped directly in front of his small rental house. And when he stepped out onto the porch, he immediately knew the car didn't belong there, not in a neighborhood where everything felt worn in and practical. And for a second he assumed it was lost, until the driver's door opened and Rachel Hayes stepped out, composed as ever, yet somehow out of place in a way he couldn't quite explain, standing there without an assistant, without a folder, without any of the usual distance she carried at the office. And when she walked toward him and said his name, Michael, it landed differently than he expected, not like a superior addressing an employee, but like someone who had come a long way without fully knowing what they would find. He didn't greet her warmly, but he didn't shut the door either, just stood there for a moment before saying, "That's a long drive for someone who already quit." And she met that with a calm, steady reply. I needed to understand why. And something in the way she said it made him pause, because there was no edge, no hidden pressure, just a simple truth. And after a brief hesitation, he stepped aside and offered coffee, more out of instinct than invitation, and she accepted, following him into a house that still felt temporary, unfinished, like a place built out of necessity rather than choice. Rachel's eyes moved quietly across the room, taking in the therapy equipment, the scattered drawings taped along the walls, the small details that told a story without needing explanation. And then Ava appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar presence, her movements careful, her gaze steady and curious, and Rachel shifted slightly, lowering herself just enough to meet her at eye level, saying, "Hi, Ava," with a softness that wasn't rehearsed. And though Ava didn't respond with words, she didn't retreat either, stepping closer and reaching out to touch the edge of Rachel's sleeve with quiet intent, a small gesture that Michael recognized as trust, or at least the beginning of it. And Rachel didn't interrupt the moment, didn't react beyond allowing it, which told him more than anything else could have. They moved to the porch after that, sitting with their coffee as the afternoon stretched around them, talking, at first about simple things, the drive, the town, the kind of conversation people used to avoid what they actually came to say, until Rachel finally set her cup down and said, "I read your file." And Michael let out a small breath, not surprised, just tired of the idea that his life had been reduced to something that could be reviewed after the fact. And she continued, "Including your request." Her tone steady, but different now, more direct. "It shouldn't have been denied." And he looked at her. Then, tried to decide what that meant, whether it was an apology or something else entirely. And when he didn't respond, she added, "Not because of policy, but because of judgment." And there was no attempt to soften it, no corporate phrasing to hide behind. just a clear acknowledgement of what had happened, and for a moment, that honesty unsettled him more than the denial itself had, because it came too late to change anything. He shook his head slightly and said, "It doesn't matter now," and he meant it, because he had already stepped away, already chosen a different path, one that revolved entirely around Ava and the fragile progress she was starting to make. But Rachel didn't argue, didn't try to pull him back into something he had already left. Instead, she said, "I'm not here to bring you back." And that caught him off guard, because it wasn't what he expected. And she continued, "I'm here because what happened to you is happening to other people, and I didn't see it clearly until you left." And Michael leaned back slightly, listening now in a way he hadn't intended to, because there was something different in her voice, something that wasn't about the company as it was, but about what it could be. And she said, "I'm building something new, something that doesn't force people to choose when their lives fall apart." And he looked out at the yard, at the small space that had become their world, trying to imagine what that meant in reality. And he said, "That kind of thing doesn't exist." And she nodded, not disagreeing, just acknowledging, "Not yet," before adding, "That's why I need someone who knows what it should look like." And the words hummed there between them, not a formal offer, not a demand, just a possibility. And Michael didn't answer right away, because part of him wanted to dismiss it, to protect the fragile stability he had built over the past few days. But another part, quieter and harder to ignore, recognized the weight of what she was saying, and before he could sort through any of it, Ava stepped onto the porch again, holding one of her drawings, extending it first toward him and then, after a brief pause, toward Rachel. And when Rachel accepted it carefully, studying it with the same attention she had given everything else, Michael realized this wasn't just a visit. It was something unfinished arriving at his door, asking a question he wasn't ready to answer. Michael didn't give Rachel an answer that day, and she didn't ask for one, leaving quietly and taking the long drive back while her words stayed behind, lingering in the spaces of his new life. Because over the next few days, as he settled deeper into caring for Ava, helping with her exercises, watching her small but meaningful progress, he kept thinking about the choice he had been forced to make and whether it really had to be that way for everyone. He saw the difference his presence was already making, the way Ava focused a little longer, the way her movements grew steadier. And then one evening, as he sat beside her, she made a sound closer to a word than anything he had heard in months, soft but real. And in that moment, something inside him settled, a quiet certainty that he had made the right decision, not just to leave, but to be here. That night, sitting alone at the kitchen table, the future didn't feel uncertain anymore. It felt open, and by morning, he knew what to do. So he called Rachel and told her he would help, but only if it was built differently, around real lives, not rigid rules. And she agreed without hesitation. The work that followed fit into his life instead of replacing it, allowing him to stay by Ava's side, while helping create something that gave others the same chance. And months later, when the program launched and began changing lives quietly, the real moment that mattered came at home, when Ava looked up at him one afternoon and said, clearly, "Dad." And he smiled, knowing he hadn't just chosen her. He had built a life where he never had to choose again.